Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So today we are going to be trying out some new acrylic markers, as the lovely people at Ohuhu were very kind and sent me their newly released Hilo acrylic marker set. And this is a 72 color acrylic marker set, but the fun thing about this one, so I'm going to show you guys on the back of this little cover. You're gonna see the color swatches, and there's something really nice about these colors is the fact that there's a lot of transitional colors in between the main color families, I guess you could say, because these markers are supposed to be acrylic markers that are very easily to be blendable. So I'm very excited to try this out. As you guys know that when I use acrylic markers, I rarely do blending as I have difficulties doing this. So hopefully using these markers will at least help me out with the blending process. So now that we have opened the case, you're greeted with kind of two larger panels that have all your colors on them, front and back, which is really nice. They're really snug and secure in their individual little packaging, I guess. And then on the front-sided cover, we have our user manual, as well as two little swatch sheets. Now, I always love that they always include a white and a black version so that you can see the colors both on a light surface and a dark surface, as acrylic markers tend to do well on both. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at one of the individual markers. So if you guys are not familiar with these acrylic markers, these are the direct ink version of these acrylic markers, so it requires no pumping. It has a little clear window with a cute design so you can see your paint reservoir. On the cap, you have your color code as well as a little stopper so your pens don't actually start rolling around because the barrels are round. So upon opening the marker itself, you can see that it is indeed a brush tip or brush nib. And I find that this is typically my favorite to use, as it's the most versatile for both filling in larger areas as well as smaller areas. So let's go ahead and fill up this swatch sheet so we can see all of our lovely colors in the set. Just a reminder, these markers pretty much require no prep. You just basically shake and go. So it has a little bit less mess. You don't have to like press a button. I always find that these ones in particular, or this type of marker, they typically keep pretty juicy. I didn't have really any issue with coverage or having them become dry at any point. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. I find that the brush tip also usually holds up their shape pretty well. But with our color swatches pretty much finished, let's go ahead and do a little bit of testing. So you can kind of see very deliberate color families, and a lot of colors in each of those color families have like many different midtones, I guess, before we get like to our darks or going upwards and going towards our light colors, I guess. And I feel like that's one of the biggest benefits of this set, is the fact that it has so many transitional colors to allow you to have an easier time blending, especially if you're going from a dark color to a light color. So I'm going to be doing a bunch of different tests on this sheet of watercolor paper so I can show you guys. I do a little bit of kind of going back and forth, starting from laying down one color and then going from the opposite direction, going into the same color. And then I do another one where I basically start mixing the color within our wet paint and then moving it across until we get back to our original color, just to see if there is a difference. Now, like I mentioned, the colors themselves have so many colors in between if you're kind of transitioning from dark to light. So because of that, it does require a little less, I guess, like mixing physically of the colors, because there's enough transition in between that you're not jumping from one value to another so abruptly, which in turn gives you a more seamless blend. But if you do want to blend a little bit more, you can definitely blend physically, like I'm doing here with the blue and the green, as well as this kind of like teal turquoise color alongside with a skin tone color, which, you know, they're not on the same color family, nor are they technically the same value, but if you do spend a little bit more time, you can get a kind of like mid-tone color in between them and slowly transition it right back out into its original color. So I find it very easy, at least for me so far on this paper, for me to blend out and, you know, see the transition. And at this point I was testing, so if I did have a harsher transition like I did in this blue, I just went back and forth with the two markers again so that we can kind of just smooth it out while the paint was still wet. So here's the kind of close-up of our different gradations or the different mixing that I was trying to do. And I think Just from the very brief testing, I understand how exactly I want to blend, so I decided to do the same thing in my sketchbook because the paper will be different. I do definitely think that you should do tests on different papers that you believe you might use the medium on. I did notice that on the watercolor paper, there was no pilling, but because I was using it on my notebook paper, it did have a little bit more of that pilling feeling because I'm moving the brush back and forth to do a lot of mixing. And obviously it's going to depend on how you like to mix your markers and or how you like to work. So, you know, to each your own, but make sure to do testing. And speaking of testing, we're going to be doing 3 illustrations today. I'll make sure to leave little timestamps of each of the illustrations if you want to see different versions. I am going to be drawing more Genshin Impact characters. I'm very fond of the Shinj Nyan main cast so far. So we're going to be drawing Valeri first in my sketchbook. So I wanted to see how these markers react as well as test out the blending capability. I typically don't mind not having super smooth transitions or a lot of blending, but one place that I usually like having it is in the skin. So starting off right at like the very start, I decided to choose, I think, 2 skin tone colors, a pink, and then I had 2 different kind of like a pinkish purple and more of a bluish purple so that we can do a little bit of a gradation like right under the chin, which I'm working on right now. So starting off with our cooler purple, kind of like almost a lavender color, going in with our warmer pink and trying my best to mix them in. Now, I still am experimenting a little bit with how I wanted to work with these markers at this point, where I was either mixing a lot like physically with the brush tips themselves, but do I like mixing my lighter color into one color, or do I like starting in the main color and slowly gradually fading back out? So I kind of do a mixture of both here and there. I think for smaller areas, it is easier for me to rely on the brush tip portion where we're using the very smaller tip of the nib to do a lot of the mixing so that it's kind of more subtle if you do want to have a bit of a smoother transition, or if you're working in larger areas, just like actually physically mixing with the marker does work very well as well. So for Valeri's skin, he does look a little bit more pinky right now. It is going to look a little bit less intense once we add in his hair because it is a lot darker. But another fun thing about these markers, and it could be also me being afraid of using more blending techniques with previous marker sets as well, and the fact that, like I mentioned, the colors does help eliminate a lot of the choosing for me in terms of like, oh, if I want to go from a light purple to a dark purple, they have many different values in between that help kind of like transition everything. Even if you don't get like a super smooth, seamless blend at the very beginning, the colors are so close together in terms of value that they kind of give you that gradation anyways, which is very nice to work with. So when I was working with Valeri's hair, I was scared of going from dark to light initially, so you're gonna see me do a lot of back and forth, but I feel like the shapes actually turned out pretty well. And like I mentioned before, my main concern is not to get everything super smooth. I think that's like always going to be something that's difficult to achieve in general because you're going to be fighting sometimes with your paper type, or, you know, there's just different things that I feel like sometimes is a little bit out of your control. But these markers definitely make it a lot easier, at least for me, to transition colors in a way that I feel like is very satisfying with the color choices, alongside with the fact that I don't know if it's the paint consistency is kind of different. I don't know. It feels also very easy for me to blend the wet to wet paint. Does that make sense? Because you're not typically going to be blending wet to dry if you're not using any other like external tools like a separate paintbrush or your finger or any of that. It's mostly you're working wet on wet, and I found that the dry time is just kind of like perfect for me. It wasn't like super long where I'm constantly putting my hand in the paint, but also wasn't like super fast, so I wasn't able to work with like, you know, blending. Even though I think later on when I work on our second character, I will have more places where I'll be showing you guys more real-time blending, because I don't want to fool people thinking that I am trying to like, you know, run on a clock where I'm speedily trying to blend everything in. It does give you a little bit of wiggle room, which I am really thankful for, because I don't think having the pressure of like, in order to blend colors, you need to be as quick as possible. But yeah, that's definitely a benefit with the color choices that this Hilo set has. And I think it's a good base set too. So if you haven't used like acrylic markers before, this one's like a very good set with in terms of like the color range. For the most part, it hits a lot of the color families right off the bat. Or if you are planning on getting more like supplementary sets, I think this one is also very good because it has so many of those mid-tone colors for transitions. I feel like it would be great to accompany it with another set. So yeah, definitely check it out if you're interested though. But I think Valeri is pretty much finished. I know his hair may have turned out a little bit too purple compared to how his hair actually is in game and like for his official art. I do apologize about that, but I wanted to play around with the purples. They're super pretty and I feel like the transitions would look super nice, so I wanted to draw him. But speaking of about more Genshin characters, I have 2 more drawings that I want to do and squeeze into today's video. We are going to be working on the smaller one first. We'll save Vonyanitsa for a little bit later in the video. She'll be our final piece. But right now we're going to be drawing, or I guess like in this case, coloring. I know I'm going to say his name wrong, Alyosha. I know I'm going to be butchering his name too much. I apologize. I know someone tried correcting me and teaching me how to say it. I might have to look up the video. Unfortunately, like a written description doesn't change my pronunciation for it directly because it's hard for me to imagine. But so if it irks you, I do apologize. But for his drawing specifically, alongside I guess with Vonyanitsa, I ended up drawing and painting on these little linen panels, which I feel like you guys are very familiar with because I typically like using them whenever I'm working with acrylic markers. I feel like it's just like a fun size and the colors really pop. So this one in particular of Alyosha, I am focusing a little bit more on hopefully blending out certain colors in his hair. So his hair color, it's a little hard for me to describe. It's very light in color. It's almost like a yellowy green-ish mint almost. I don't know how to explain it. So because I don't have that color available, we're gonna have to do a bit of color mixing alongside with just adding a bunch of different colors and seeing what sticks. So hopefully it won't turn out too bad. And I feel like the background that I ended up choosing, because I wanted more of like a winter or colder scene, it definitely helps with the fact that a lot of the colors, like I mentioned, are very good at being able to transition. So it's very easy for me to pick, I think, like 3 blues or something together and fade it out to white to kind of get a softer looking background at least. On the linen panel, because it does take a little bit more time for the paint to absorb, I do have a little bit more wiggle room in terms of the dry time. So I am going to try my best to take advantage of that, but it also means that sometimes I'm going to require maybe 2 passes for certain areas to get it looking more flat, because it takes a little bit for it to absorb right into the panel. It kind of sits on the surface and rather than getting absorbed, so you might see a little bit of streakiness here and there. So hopefully you don't think it's actually like from the markers or anything. I don't find any of these markers like super thinned out. I know some acrylic markers or alcohol markers, the lighter colors typically are a little bit more translucent. These ones all had pretty good coverage from my knowledge from when I was using them. I didn't really run into that issue. I think the most noticeable place is when like his gloves are, I guess the contrast of my camera makes it more dramatic looking, but there is streakiness in his gloves because of the way how the linen panel and this kind of like paint marker work together. But for the most part, it's like an easy cover up. I just wasn't too compelled because it didn't really bother me, but I know for some people might want like a solid fill. But for this one in particular, I wanted to go a little bit more painterly. I'm not the type that likes doing a lot of like painting mediums that's not watercolors. I struggle with it a lot, and I like control. But this type of like, I don't know if it's the blending capabilities of these markers. I had a lot more fun being able to blend colors, but also leave some brush strokey kind of look to some of the areas where I'm coloring, because there's enough of like the colors being transitioned in a way that still reads somewhat soft, but then me being able to like have some areas blend and then some not. I guess it gives it a little bit more of that painterly look as well. So I really enjoyed using this one, more specifically for this drawing, because I actually really like how the end result looks like at the very end. And here's like another benefit. I didn't really talk about it when I was doing Valeri's illustration. The benefit of using a brush tip. So a lot of like the background or like the hair, all that, I'm kind of utilizing the entire brush of the brush nib. So I'm using almost like the full side of it so that I can get full coverage, and then sometimes I'm using it to flick so that we can get some sharper areas for the hair, or if I want to get more of like a faded look, I will flick the paint marker typically so that it doesn't give me like a full coverage at like full opacity, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. Otherwise, if I'm doing like detailing or line work, I don't like switching to a different medium sometimes. Partly, I'm lazy. But the other part is that on linen panels, on paintings, anything has like a bit of a glossier surface. I don't know which pens or markers will dry nicely on it in a manner that I won't accidentally like put my hand in and start smudging, or it will react if I need to paint over it. So I like the fact that I don't have to change mediums. I can use the exact same markers that I was using earlier to do our thinner lines for our line art. Now, unfortunately, I did have caffeine those days, so my hands were a little bit shaky. There are like some areas I did have like nice kind of like really thin lines, but then other areas were a little bit more shaky, so I ended up, you know, darkening them up or thickening up the lines so that they don't read shaky, but it also helps a little bit with feigning a little bit of that depth, I guess, with the line width variation. So I was kind of like not too bothered by it. I also like the what is it called? The dark blue. The dark blue, I think for this overall color palette actually worked. It didn't show up as nicely on the gloves, so I ended up going with an even deeper blue. It's kind of like in the navy territory, but everything else kind of has like the darker kind of blue for the line work, which I think fits and helps. One little last detail and something I wanted to try, which didn't really work out, which is I wanted to add little snow fluttering everywhere, and I wanted to see if I could blur some of them out afterwards or give them like a slight glow, but I usually achieve that by doing dry brushing, but I didn't really want to pull out any brushes, so I tried using my finger, and I feel like it just looks like finger smudges instead. So, you know, some things might not work in my favor, but you know, that's okay. But moving along, we're moving to our last illustration for today's video and kind of like last demonstration piece, which I also ended up really liking and having a very fun time working with the markers. I have a very particular color palette or a color that I really like to use, and I feel like Vonyanitsa kind of hits that color palette. I know the colors are going to be slightly off for each of the characters that I've drawn today, but part of it is because I don't have the same exact colors, and another is because I'm more focused on vibrancy of the colors right now rather than like color accuracy per se. So yeah, if they're a little bit off, hopefully it doesn't irk you too much. But starting off with the coloring process, I'm doing very much the same steps for all three of the illustrations. So I started off with using kind of one of the mid-tone, darker, warmer pinks, and then using our, I think one of the second lightest skin tone colors to blend it out, and then going to our lightest color to blend it out completely, and hopefully having a little bit more of like a flushed skin tone is what I'm looking for. But I think I mentioned at the beginning of the video that my priority typically is not to make sure that everything is super blended. There's just like some areas I like to focus on, and I said that the face is one of them. Another area I like is larger pieces of hair, if there is supposed to be some sort of like color transition that we can play with. So Vonyanitsa I feel like is a better example of this compared to how I did the coloring for Valeri as well as Alyosha. So for Vonyanitsa, I ended up going with like a darker turquoise color near the crown of her head, where I would be placing most of our band of highlight near kind of like the top of the crown of her head, like I mentioned, so that we can have as much contrast for the shine. This just gives an illusion for like a shinier hair color, texture, whatever you want to call it. And as we gradually get closer to the face, I try my best to kind of fade it out, and once we get basically the hair that literally is bordering the face, I will add some skin tone to try my best to blend it out a little bit. Now, I did mention earlier that it is easier to blend out colors or have those softer transitions if you have colors within the same color family, as well as like similar-ish in value, so that you're not having super big jumps. Or you can take a little bit more time and blend it out physically and just like, you know, take your time to actually mix almost like a new color on your canvas directly, which sometimes I will have to do if I'm doing like a skin tone to like, let's say a blue color. In this case, it's more of like that turquoise, minty, sea foamy green color. So because of that, I did have to put a little bit more effort. It's a little patchy here and there, but for the most part, I feel like it looks kind of smooth from afar, so I'm not too bothered by it. But for some of the longer locks of Vanyanitsa's hair, as well as like her little fins on her head, I did a little bit more blending. So we're transitioning from kind of like a sky blue to a lighter blue to a white to kind of give it more of that lighter translucent look. And then later on, once we start working on the hair, I go from our seafoam green. We're gonna add a little bit of lighter green, sometimes a yellow. I will add in blue or like a purple. So I'm gonna try my best to transition as many of the colors as I could for her hair, because that was kind of like my main goal in terms of like wanting to draw her. I also just like drawing her. I think her design is like super cute, and I feel like this might be like the third time you've seen me draw this pose specifically for her. I'm trying to see if this is something like I want to make a digital illustration of in the future. I have like one more idea which I might do instead, because I feel like the angle of this is harder to see the entirety of her outfit, which I would like to include more of. So that might be something I'll talk about in like a future video though. Oh, this is like another area I had like a lot of fun trying to transition our colors. So instead of just like the seafoamy green going into like more of a purpley blue, I ended up using like a darker green. And for the most part, it did kind of work. I definitely think like adding the lines to hide a little bit of some of my patchier transitions made it a little bit easier on the eyes. And also, apologies, like the footage is going to go by super quickly because this did take me, I think Vonyanitsa took me 3-ish hours. Alyosha, I think, took me 2 hours. So what are we at? 5-ish hours. And then Valeri plus like supplementary other stuff, I think in total was about 7 hours of just working on all three, which feels like a long time. But I had like such a fun time just using these markers. I don't know. I might have been too scared of doing blending with acrylic markers for so long. I didn't realize how much I might have been missing out on mixing new colors or having smoother transitions to make things look a little bit more smooth, I guess. I'm always been using, I don't know, I've been always timid to blend with markers typically because I can never get them to look super smooth without like having to smudge with my finger, and then sometimes it doesn't work in my favor because I can't see, or like, you know, my finger is a little bit more of like a blunt object, so it's a little bit harder for me to do smaller details. But these markers has made it very easy for me to even like want to blend. So like I mentioned earlier, the hair. So I wanted to add more like yellow into her hair to kind of like catch a little bit more light. So I ended up picking like a lighter yellow to hopefully transition into a green, then back to our kind of like lighter seafoamy green to our turquoise. So hopefully you can kind of see that in the hair. The only places I feel like I blended a little bit less is like if I want harsher shadows. I feel like it lends a little bit better to have like those sharper areas of non-blended shapes. Does that make sense? Otherwise, if everything's too blended, well, I guess it could look good if you have like line art in contrast. I usually don't like the look of something like overly too soft, if that makes sense. I like having a contrast of both, or I go more extreme to one side where I typically, for acrylic markers, just mostly use like a cell shading method and just hope for the best that the colors won't look too off. There's a lot more wiggle room if you do a lot more blending or mixing or adding a little bit more of that painterly flair to it. So it's something fun to experiment. So if you're kind of like me and you're a little bit scared of using blending, give it a go or try out these markers. I think it's definitely a fun set to try out because, like I said, it's set up in a very nice way where visually you can see the transition for the colors, but like the way that the markers are, as well as like the color selection, and just like, I don't know, this is something that was very easy for me to use and work with these to the point where I was like, yeah, I'll color the whole background and do a gradation. I am not in love with the color that I chose for the background. I feel like overall it still works because I did have like pops of like yellowy green in her entire piece anyway, so visually it kind of works. I would have liked maybe a purple or a pink for the background, only because I feel like Vonyanitsa is a little bit on the softer side, but because I leaned her piece entirely more towards like the blue-green instead of like a bluish purple, I thought maybe the lime green might have worked. I don't know. You can tell me if you think the lime green works with this piece or not. I ended up just like, you know, wanting to do like another gradient similar to the one that I did Alyosha with the blue, because I found it fun having the lighter colors and blending it out with white to the white of the canvas. I found it very easy to get a gradation like that too. So, you know, a little bit of fun experimenting with the colors here. And now, back to one of my favorite steps of finishing off these pieces is doing line art. And as I mentioned in Alyosha's piece is the fact that I do enjoy that these brush tips typically have a pretty good tip on them. I don't think I saw any really like deterioration of the brush tip nib. Sometimes like different materials, they get a little bit roughened to the point where the tip is no longer sharp and you're not able to get like your super thin lines after using them maybe a little too roughly. I'm definitely guilty of that, but these ones held up the tip shape very nicely, so I was still able to do my line art quite comfortably. But here's Vonyanitsa alongside with her. We have Alyosha done on the smaller linen canvas board, and then we have Valeri in my sketchbook. So 3 different sessions to hopefully get used to using the acrylic markers as intended, and I actually really enjoyed these. So I feel like if you're interested in checking out a set of acrylic markers, especially if you want to try out like more blending, I highly recommend the set. I feel like it's more beginner friendly, especially with the way how they set up the markers color family, like I've been saying all over this video. But thank you again to Ohuhu for sending me these markers to try out and show you guys, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!